Hello and welcome to our virtual Living History Day event. Traditionally, we would be doing this in a face-to-face environment. However, due to the pandemic of 2020, we are unable to do so. As a result, the History Department of Texas Southmost College has decided to do a virtual Living History Day through a series of recordings and collaborations with our partners. My name is Doug Yarker, the interim chair of the Arts, Business, and History Department, and I would like to thank a few members of our history department as well as our partners for their contributions. I would like to thank Professor Robert Raymaker, Professor Jamie Sines, and Dr. Eloy Garcia of our history department for coming together to put on this production. I would also like to thank Erica Ramirez, as well as Palo Alto Battlefield National Historical Park for their contributions to this event. I certainly hope you enjoy and sit back and relax and enjoy our presentation on local history as well as history around the world today. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Eloy Garcia, and I am a history instructor here at TSC, and welcome to our virtual History Day. Students, during our normal History Day, if we weren't in the pandemic, you would have the chance to look at, try on some of the different armor that we'd have available on the different tables. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some old world armor that eventually makes its way and some of its influences into the New World later on in the 15th century. I'd like to start, students, by showing you this fine Persian helmet. What you see is the chainmail back. You also see, students, the adjustable nose piece. Some of these helmets are called nasal helmets because of the protection for the nasal area, the face and the nose. You'll see a spike on the top, students, and you'll also notice, students, this is called damascened armor. Okay, this is fine parade armor. What you see is steel that has been inlaid with the precious metal, usually silver or gold. This is gold, students. It's etched, and then solid gold, students, is damascened into the armor. This is a fine piece of parade armor. Middle Eastern origin, probably circa 13th, 14th century. Okay, that's the parade helmet. And then these attributes, students, they would have feathers, etc., to add to the glory, especially when you're riding on horseback. Imagine you're flying with large feathers, etc., horsehair, plumes. It just adds another shocking visual element to the rider on horseback. Okay, let's see what else we got. That was the example of the helmet. Let me show you also examples, students, of a small buckler or a small shield that they would use. This is a small shield, students, also of Middle Eastern origin. Also, you notice the fine damascened ornamentation. This one has also been cut, right, in very intricate geometrical shapes. What you've got is basically an armband here where you would hold to allow you quick access and agility when you're fighting with the sword. Okay, this is a small buckler or a shield. Again, this is parade armor. Let's see what else we got. I want to show you an example, students, of some body armor. This is a small forearm piece, again, highly intricate, inlaid with gold. They're very heavy, by the way, just because of the gold content to protect your forearm when you're in battle. Now, this, students, would also be used in collaboration with what you see now. I'm wearing a chainmail coat, okay, a chainmail coat. These are small little rings, students, that have been fastened together. It's almost like a sewn material. This is ancient body armor. For any of you veterans out there, you know the importance of body armor to protect your vital organs. The ancient body armor, students, some of this that came from the Middle East, was chain link. If you were very wealthy and were able to buy finer suits of armor, students, the bigger the links, the more intricately woven, the more protection they would give you. This one, students, has smaller links. It's not as intricate, it's not elaborate and heavy as some of the other chainmail outfits that you can see. But this would provide a pretty decent level of protection. Uh, mostly from glancing blows from a sword. Now remember though, this will keep stuff from penetrating all the way. It'll still penetrate to a certain degree. But remember, if someone hits you with the thing, it can also do damages to your bones. Okay, let me give you an example. This, students, is a Persian war axe. Okay, what these axes were used, it has basically three different weapons on it. The first weapon is to allow you to split open any type of plate armor, right? The second one would also be used, students, to knock someone in the head. And then also after you opened up their plate armor, then you finish them off with the pointed edge. Now, this particular war axe, students, is one of my favorites, not only because of its elaborate Islamic symbolism and beautiful designs, but also because it has two parts. This war axe, students, comes in two parts. Basically sews together. So when you're in battle and you need basically two weapons, if you're quick, now you've got a war axe, students, and almost a short little lance, a pike that you can fight two-handed. Many of these warrior students that had been brought up and skilled in hand-to-hand combat were very agile and able to fight with two different weapons, left and right hand, and ambidextrous. Okay, it's one of my favorite weapons in my collection, students. Islamic war axe, short javelin. Okay, let's see what else we got. Now, these were Middle Eastern weapon, students, that are going to be introduced through Asia into Spain in the 7th century. Now, remember, the uh, the Moors from North Africa, students, are going to invade Spain in the year 700. They're going to stay there till 1492. 1492 until King Ferdinand and Isabella basically unite the Spanish kingdoms to fight back what they called the Moorish hordes who had invaded the Catholic peninsula of Spain. Now, these types of armor, students, who we had talked about, the shield, the war axe, the helmet, are also going to be brought with those Spanish soldiers, with the Spanish students when they cross over into the New World. Now, let's talk about the frontier region of areas like Texas and New Mexico. Students, they would, through various expeditions, bring this type of armor into the Southwest, what we know now as the borderlands. They would wear chainmail coats that wasn't as heavy and exhausting as plate armor. They would use different types of battle axes, more predominantly the halberd, that were 6 or 7 foot long with an axe edge on them and a point, maybe a spontoon. Would use various shields and body armor. But also remember, students, as most soldiers recognize, body armor needs to be adequate to protect you, but it also needs to be uh, feasible in the field. If it's too hot, if you're overheating, if it's too exhausting, if it rots or corrodes quickly in subtropical climates, most of the time soldiers, if they can't use it, they'll just jettison it and try to find and use some different things. Now let's talk about in the New World, students. We talked about the use of the steel buckler that came from the Middle East in the area. What there's going to develop in the Southwest, students, because metal and steel were so valuable and so rare in the frontier regions, is a different type of shield, what we call the adarga. The adarga, students, had been used by the Muslim armies of the Moor students in Spain and the Spanish Peninsula, and they were this large, heart-shaped pieces of thick leather. Okay, this is an adarga shield that I made, students. Okay, what you see painted on is basically the crest of Leon and Castile, the saying of the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire, plus ultra, from the Presidio Santa Fe. Remember, students, Santa Fe, New Mexico, this was part of the Spanish borderlands up until 1821, and they did have a presidio there that was put in place to house the Spanish soldiers to protect the missionaries. Now, this adarga, students, was made out of 2 or 3 levels, if you see it in the back, laced together by hand of elk and cowhide. Then, after it's laced together, students, it's boiled in hot water and what's called bouillon. After leather, students, is boiled and shrinked in hot water, it gets this armor-like appearance. These shield, students, were known to reject arrows. They couldn't reject a shot from a flintlock or a wheel lock later on. But very good students. They were lightweight. They were they were very uh, nimble. They allowed the soldiers on horseback and the Spanish soldiers on the frontier students adequate protection against arrows, against most glancing blows of from the native weapons, and it wouldn't corrode. Okay, the Spanish adarga. These are very extremely rare to find something like this. This is a reproduction, students, that I made on my own. It took a while to build it. Pretty proud of it. I think it came out pretty nice. But to find something like this, students, is very rare. The only other ones I've seen, the one in the Royal Armory in Madrid, Spain. I've seen another one in the Alhambra Palace in Granada, and another one in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, and one other at the Bullock Museum in Texas, the Adarga, these small leather shields. Now, along with these small leather shields, students, something else that they would use that eventually makes its way from Asia into the Americas is the use of gunpowder, the flintlock. Students, this is a small example of what would be a French cavalry pistol, circa about 1801, 1802. It's fired, students, by igniting a piece of flint up against a piece of steel. You would put your gunpowder, students, in the piece of steel. Well, let me start. First of all, what you would do, students, these were muzzle loading weapons. You would put in your 54 caliber slug, usually a small lead ball. You'd put your wadding in your powder, students, and you would pack it down. Then you would open up your pan. Your flash pan is what they would call. You'd load it up with some powder, students. Then you would cock your pistol. The flintlock would move forward. The flint, students, if you see the flint wrapped in a piece of leather, would strike against the striker, causing a spark. The spark, students, would ignite a small explosion into the combustion chamber, firing the pistol, a small mini explosion. Now, these students, they look cool. They're heavy, they're good weapons, but the unfortunate thing is that they're very unreliable. The powder would get wet, the powder would get moist, and they were prone to misfiring. Now, students, these are the kind of pistols that Aaron Burr would perhaps use in his duel against Alexander Hamilton, where they would walk off 15 paces or whatever it was, word turn and fire. Most of these things were prone to misfiring. This is where you get the saying, students, of flash in the pan, a person who comes to light and does something great and all of a sudden fizzles out. The flash in the pan, students, is reference to this pan. When it wouldn't fire, it would sizzle real bright and it wouldn't fire. Most of these weapons, students, were used for personal defense, but unfortunately, because they were so unreliable, they would have a very heavy butted end. If you see this one, this is a butted end covered with a bronze plate, students, that were used mostly for a club. Unfortunately, you read about these primary sources where most of the time, maybe you'd get a shot off, you would take so long to reload, by that time they'd be on top of you, and then you start swinging it and try to save your life, okay? The small flintlock pistol, about circa 1801. Now, these weapons, students, the flintlock pistol and the adarga, interesting enough, in the places of borderlands of New Mexico, California, and Arizona, where the leather jacketed soldiers of Spain would use these weapons, they would use these weapons, students, in the American continent. Interesting enough, from about the 16th century, from the 19th century, for about 300 years, students, we were still using this very basic technology. And in fact, when the United States invades the borderlands, students, in 1846, the people of Texas, California, and New Mexico, who rise up to protect their lands from the US invasion, are still using these antiquated weapons. So you can barely guess the reason, students, for the downfall and for the US eventual conquest of the Southwest was due to a large part to antiquated weapons and the lack of modern weapons by the Mexican people who were trying to protect their lands. So I just wanted to talk to you about these few weapons, students, show you a few examples of my own personal collection. And I'm hoping, students, that in the future we're allowed to do a true example of History Day where you can walk with us, touch these weapons, shoot them, some of the weapons, dry fire, of course, and maybe handle some of these battle axes. Okay. I thank you for your time, and I hope you guys have a good day.
Today on Hands on History, we're going to take a look at the Spanish conquistador, really in the 16th century time period. So we'll talk about the nature of the armor, we'll look at the weapons, the daily life of the average Spaniard, and ultimately we'll break it down as far as why small numbers of conquistadors are able to defeat much larger groups of natives. Have you ever wanted to quit your day job and conquer some shit? Well, this is for you. Let's take a look. Hands on History, where we don't just learn from history, we live it. Today on Hands on History, we're going to take a look at the Spanish conquistador, really the weapons and armor of the 16th century, and talk about the nature and historical context of why some of these things came to be. Every armor has a story, every weapon has a story. Hopefully, we can begin the process of looking at it. Obviously, it's not the last word on the subject. That's for all of y'all. Feel free to comment, like, subscribe, etc. Feel free to present your own stories as far as your own research and what you've looked at into. But what I was looking for primarily is for my 1301, my 1302 classes. They obviously asked me a lot of questions on the conquistador, where we live. It's a very potent topic. And so I just like to address what it was like to be an average soldier. It's always what's fascinated me is the battlefields of Europe and Asia. Not necessarily what command went through, because we have a pretty good idea usually from the books that say Grant did this or Lee did that. But I like to look at what the common soldier did. It's my opinion they're the ones that ultimately win the battles. So what was it like to be a conquistador? What kind of weapons did these guys use? The armor, tactics of the day. Those are all things that we're going to be exploring today. Mostly the targeted audience here is primarily my 1301 and 1302 classes, but obviously general audience as well. If you're somebody who's interested in this period, if you're somebody who wants to know a little bit more, hopefully we can break down the day-to-day aspects of what it was like. We have really good sources on this, everything from Bernal Diaz to as far as primary sources, they're okay. Mostly from the Spanish perspective, not a whole lot of stuff from the native perspective. We got some codexes, right, that will help us as well. But not as many sources as we would wish. Certainly, there's some gaps in the resource material. So we tend to fill those in as much as we can through reenactment. And so the purpose of reenactment largely is to recreate a historical period. And again, the point of that is to look at what the average person did. So that's what we're going to be exploring today and taking a little bit of a look at. First of all, we'll start as far as the weapons of the conquistador. They changed over time, obviously, but in the 16th century, these were some of the weapons that you could see on a type of soldier that was called a rodolero. Rodoleros were so named for their large shield, which we'll talk about later. But basically, these were sword and shield kind of guys. Sometimes they're called sword and buckler, but it's kind of a misnomer to call them this because a buckler is a tiny shield, all right, that people could basically just carry on their belts. And this thing's going to be much larger. So it's kind of more of a throwback to shields from the earlier years that were larger and covered large segments of the body. And so they got this name, right, these rodoleros, right, guys who essentially were carrying the very famous Spanish side sword or espada ropera, and of course the patented rodela shield. These guys would have been fairly well armored. It really depended because, as far as the historical context, most of the conquistadors themselves had served as mercenaries in past campaigns. They'd done fighting, and usually these companies' rules, there weren't any. They basically could procure their own equipment as they could so fit. So that included grabbing weapons off the battlefield, and it included providing their own. So the vast majority of soldiers, contrary to the popular myth of everybody being encased in armor and coming to the New World, is a fallacy. The vast majority of people who came to the New World didn't have a lot of armor at all. In fact, I'm going to represent really about the top 5 to 10% of the conquistadors as far as kit and what they're going to be wearing into battle. So we'll talk about the nature of the kit. We'll talk about essentially some of its function, and we'll basically describe what it is about the Conquistador's kit that largely makes them effective. So the first Okay, we're continuing our discussion today about the Spanish Conquistador, particularly the weapons and armaments of the Conquistador. And what we're going to be looking at today are the accoutrements. So the things you probably don't see a whole lot of, but perform necessary functions as far as equipment. Obviously, the first thing we're going to take a look at is the gambeson. So obviously, if you look at the sources from this period, you got some guys who are wearing doublets, you got some guys who are just wearing their normal clothes, and then of course the armor goes over the top. But probably for those who wanted to be the most well protected, they would actually wear a second layer of armor that was what was known as an arming doublet or a gambeson. In this instance, right, it's usually made of threaded or quilted linen. It's very similar to actually what the Aztecs and the Incas would have been wearing in this period. This was pretty much the only kind of armor that they're going to be wearing, kind of like a sweater slash vest. And it's very effective. For the most part, you know, it's not going to turn aside most blades, but you know, it's going to give you a pretty good layer of protection. This usually kind of functions as your under armor of sorts. So basically the main armor will go over the top of this, and then obviously it's going to be stitched to it, which is going to give it some extra padding, extra flexibility and comfort. But in addition, this performs two functions. One, it gives you that extra layer of defense in case a blade or something does manage to go around or penetrate your armor. And number two, right, it's there primarily to protect you from the armor itself. Somebody who's done a lot of reenactments, you want something that's nice and cushy underneath that armor, otherwise you're going to pay for it later. Not only in muscle soreness, but it can physically cut you up. And so you can imagine in a battle where, you know, plates are going to get bashed and hit, etc., that it's probably best to have, you know, a nice concussive layer underneath that can absorb some of those concussive blows. So even if a round or if a blow doesn't necessarily go clear through the armor, right, you're still going to have to deal with the shock that comes from it. That can lead to, of course, internal injury, death, broken bones, etc. And so in a lot of ways, the gambeson is the reinforcement garment for the armor itself. It not only connects the armor to the other pieces, but it also is important because it gives you that insulation from it. The other pieces of equipment that we're going to be using primarily, at least the conquistadors would use, of course, is they're going to go into battle with their pants. Now, trousers in the medieval period are somewhat of a complicated topic because, you know, they had hose, they had trousers, they had all these different words for it, and they meant different things. Essentially, trousers, like we think of, are essentially you've got, you know, two legs connected into one garment that you can ultimately get into. These did happen in the medieval era. They weren't as common as hose, for example. Hose was all over the place. The differences between the two, trousers, obviously you've got both legs that are already stitched together. Hose, for the most part, are two separate pieces of cloth that are ultimately joined together, sometimes by a string, sometimes by a belt, sometimes by a codpiece. In this case, that's essentially what's going to be the case. In the 14 and 1500s, the nature of fashion had changed dramatically, and things started to become more frilly, they started to become more superfluous. A lot of this is because of the Swiss pikemen who at the time were dressing this way in all kinds of strange colors and stuff. And you can see this, for example, in the Pope's Guard. The Spanish were kind of more matter of fact about it, at least in the early stages, but they did adopt some aspects of it. One of the pieces, of course, that lasted as far as trousers were concerned, or as what was known as the codpiece. All right, so essentially the codpiece was basically something that would be used primarily to show off your, you know, the primary purpose was so that you could demonstrate that, you know, you as a man were definitely a man. But for the most part, you know, there was some fluff in there. Some have said that maybe it acts as a protective guard. Most of the fluff is linen or cotton based, so I don't think it's going to do a whole lot from something that goes straight at your private parts. But for the most part, it's still there. Certainly it's, you know, we think of, you know, I guess you could call it codpiece envy. There's even suits of armor. For example, Henry VIII has a suit of armor that he's famous for that has some protection for that region. You know, as a soldier going into battle, it's certainly not going to hurt you, but obviously it was probably more for fashion purposes than it was actual real protection. The other piece that the codpiece performs, which is really interesting, is that for the most part, you can see the leather strips. it basically can hold your pants together. If you're wearing hose in that situation, then you literally are wearing a pair of pants, which maybe you've heard this expression before. Pair refers to the fact that you actually had two pieces that were sewn together, usually primarily through strings, or like we talked about before. Sometimes they would just latch onto your underwear. That was also used sometimes. So there's even depictions of medieval peasants running around in their underwear, farming and doing that kind of stuff, and that's all they wear. So in this instance, things have become a little bit more, I guess you could call them civilized, but for the most part, many of the old medieval traditions still continued, like, for example, having two separate pairs of pants and then sewing them together into one. I use trousers simply because of the ease of use. Certainly soldiers that needed to put them on quickly and needed to do what they needed to do, it's going to offer some advantages. The trousers usually are made of wool, linen. In this case, they're made of wool. It's going to give you a certain amount of insulation from the elements. Certainly in the heat of the New World, it's not going to be the most comfortable garment. They tend to be extremely tight, right, as you can see. That tend to be form-fitting with something they won in the Renaissance era. It's not great for flexibility, but for the most part, those were some of the standards of the time as far as pants were concerned. In addition, you would wear your tunic. A tunic was essentially a garment that goes underneath of this even. I use it as my sweat rag, and this was basically what you would use to collect sweat. You would use it as one final layer of protection or comfort. Certainly on cold days, it's going to be fantastic. But in the heat of the New World, it's going to be problematic. Tunics were usually like a onesie for adults. They would extend very, very low, and that basically they were, really kind of pants and shirt in one. The Romans and Greeks had made use of them, certainly, and didn't usually have to wear accompanying pants alongside of them. It was basically your pants and your shirt in one. But the medieval period, they are separated. People are still wearing tunics, but they're also wearing pants as well. So those are some of the changes in fashion by this time. The last aspect of accoutrements that the conquistador is going to carry into battle are what you see here, right? Your shoes. Shoes were pretty simple. If you were a soldier and you get your hands on shoes, you were considered pretty lucky. A lot of conquistadors wore their shoes out within the first couple of months of marching all over the New World. And so a lot of times they would have to either purchase or steal the equipment of the native peoples. In particular, you're going to see, for example, sandals, native styles of clothing, native styles of shoes were adopted. That was not uncommon in the codexes and a lot of the sources from that time period. And primary sources attest to this as well, like Bernal Diaz, who talks about wearing Indian sandals. But for the most part, if you were a soldier that had shoes, you were pretty fortunate. The cavalrymen are largely going to wear boots. If you could afford to have boots, you would. But simple style medieval shoes haven't changed a whole lot, obviously, into the modern era. These obviously had toggles to fasten them, still made of leather. You can see, of course, on the bottom of them, right, for the most part, they've got some tread on there for traction. But for the most part, they're pretty general, pretty basic shoes. The form and function of the shoe hasn't changed a whole lot over the centuries. It still performs the same generalized role. So in general, we've got the shoes, we've talked about the pants, we've talked about the nature of your under armor. What we're going to address next is to ultimately look at what it is the conquistador would wear into battle. So you might be wearing this on campaign, or we're going to take a look at what guys are going to do before they know they're going to go in to the heat of battle. And so that's what we're going to take a look at next. One last feature as far as the accoutrements are concerned is to take a look at some of the leather aspects of what the conquistadors would wear. So as far as leather armor, conquistadors aren't going to wear a lot of primary leather armor. It might be worn underneath, as for example an arming doublet might be, but for the most part they're going to have some other features. One of them is of course the baldric. So they're going to have a baldric of some sort that's going to suspend the sword. The sword is going to sit in what's known as a scabbard. Usually made of leather. It can have a wood core, but usually there's leather on the outside of it. Right, so obviously the baldric's function is simply to hold the sword at the side. Conquistadors usually had swords on the left-hand sides because of the length of the swords that they were drawing. So it was usually a little bit easier to do a cross draw, right? And so when you pull the sword out, even though it's quite long, right, to get it to where you want it, right, it's easier to pull from the left-hand side, but from the right-hand side, it's going to be too long. So it's not like the Roman and Greek swords where for the most part you don't have to worry about such things because they were much shorter. But with these, especially these longer early style rapiers, right, you're going to have a pretty long sword. So for the most part you need a good size baldric and a good size belt to be able to accompany it. So obviously this is the nature of the sword, right, which is suspended from a baldric. You've also got your belt, right? A ring style belt, which was very common during the Renaissance era. Ring belts, for the most part, were made long on purpose so that the soldier could ultimately tie them and then take them through the loop. Very simple, you go under and then through the hole, and basically you've got a tied off ring belt. Ring belts were obviously easy to manufacture, cheap to maintain. You'd have to put a buckle on them. In many cases, you don't even have to make holes on them. You could just ultimately string them together fairly quickly. And so, yeah, ring belts were fairly common. You'll see a lot of them at Renaissance fairs. A lot of people in the 13, 14, and 1500s are going to wear belts that are in this style. In addition, right, you've got a holder, right, for your dagger, right, which basically holds it in place. Right, its job is ultimately to hold it so that you can draw it, right? You can basically pull it out. You can do your thing with it fairly quickly, and then if you need to, right, you can put it back in. So yeah, you've got leather holders for your dagger. You got leather holders for your sword. You got a baldric. You've got a ring belt, right? And basically, these are some of the accoutrements that are going to help to keep your weapon safe. Obviously, in the humidity and the heat of the New World, you're going to want something that's going to keep them secure so that when you do need them, right, they're going to be in the best shape possible. So these are just some of the leather aspects of what the conquistadors would use, and ultimately some of the things that they would use to secure their weapons and other aspects. Okay, we're taking a look at the armor of the conquistador. We'll take a look at the more heavily armed guys, and we'll talk about the nature of what the vast majority of guys would have been wearing during the conquest of the New World. First thing to discuss, of course, in any discussion of armor largely is breastplate. So this was also known as a cuirass. It had been known since antiquity. People have been wearing stuff that was similar to this, what we're going to call plate armor. One of the misconceptions that I hear a lot is the plate armor really starts to emerge in the 13 and 1400s. Well, the reality is that, yeah, it does, but it actually existed centuries past. Romans had developed a segmented armor that used plates. The Greeks had used bell cuirasses that had covered, obviously, much of the inner part of the body. So, by all means, Europeans aren't the first to figure this out. There were other societies in the past that had used armor in a similar fashion, but this is going to be much more thick. It's made of solid steel. It's going to be very difficult for somebody to be able to penetrate this. Most of the contemporary weapons of the time are unable to penetrate plate armor. So wearing this meant that you were going to be very, very well protected, at least certainly better protected than most of the other soldiers on the battlefield. Again, I represent a rudolero, so these guys could have afforded breastplates depending on how successful they were. And if they could, they would certainly want to wear them because of the protection that they gave and the flexibility. Another myth that we get is this idea that, when you're somebody who's wearing full plate armor, that you're not going to be able to move very effectively, right? I'm not obviously going to be able to dance very well just because I can't dance, period. But the bottom line is that you've got, this thing here that provides good protection. It's really only about 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter thick, depending on the examples that we found. You could get thicker, but at that point it just starts getting so heavy that it's really cumbersome. This thing really isn't that bad. You can move in it. You can ultimately dodge if you need to. You can run for short distances. I wouldn't recommend running a marathon in it, but it's still very effective. It's not this myth that once you get knocked off your horse or knocked into the ground that you're not going to be able to get up. That's just not true. The armor was form-fitting. Usually it would connect to a garment underneath called an akiton or an arming jacket, and it could actually connect via straps or leather strips so that it's well suited to fit the body. So this is one of the myths that I wanted to bust about the nature of the breastplate is that, people who wore this, it's so heavy they can't move around. You're looking at probably an additional 10 to 20 pounds that it's going to add. But if you're an infantryman in Iraq, for example, you're probably going to wear way more protective gear, and certainly because of your ammunition, you're probably going to have more weight that you're carrying around than what a conquistador did. So the nature of these guys carrying just, these, Herculean amounts of weight is simply not necessarily correct. So the breastplate itself gives really good protection. It's obviously something that soldiers who could afford, they're going to try to wear. The one drawback to this, of course, is that it's made of iron. In the New World, you're going to run into problems with rust, etc. But they had some interesting ways to combat that. The easiest way, which is the one we do today, is to paint it. I tend to believe that armor was in some cases painted, right? If you were somebody who didn't want to put a fresh coat of oil on it every time you take it out. The other thing, of course, is that they had servants. So these guys didn't wear these things 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had servants, they had Indians, in some cases slaves, who would carry their kit for them. And then right before they would go into battle, that's when they would slip this stuff on. So they're not going to be wearing it all day long, right, for hours at a time. Usually, unless circumstances are absolutely dire, they're going to slip this thing on, go into battle, and then when they're done, they're going to go back to the regular clothes. And the codexes and primary sources indicate this as well. So that's what's known as your breastplate. Now, attached to the breastplate, you've got these things here called tassets, right? The tassets, you can see, are basically little pieces of metal that hang off of the original plate, and their job is to give you some additional protection here in the hips. Obviously, you've got the femoral artery in here. You've got some other, things that are particularly vulnerable, and so the tassets can address that. And so they also help, particularly if you were to wear the thigh pieces and the leg pieces. They kind of give you some overlap so that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of gap in between where your armor is and where your body's going to be. And so the tassets help to kind of relieve that. And so soldiers that could get armor that had tassets attached would certainly do so. Right, so that's the nature of some of the garments to protect your abdomen. Now, other things that would be worn for personal protection, right? You can see right here, right? This is what's known as your gorget, all right? It's a neck piece. Later in the 18th century, these became ceremonial. You'll see British soldiers, for example, French soldiers that are wearing a gorget, not necessarily to protect them from musket fire, but because it's a sign of status or a status of rank. Well, in this era, it does provide some protection. The good thing is it's kind of a doublet that goes over the top of the armor. It gives you additional protection, particularly to the neck, all right, which is, the big weakness with any kind of plate armor is that although the armor itself is very good, there's going to be gaps, right, whether the shoulder and the neck, and the hips, because you have to be able to turn, you have to be able to move and anticipate. So the gorget is really good at being able to provide you with some protection so you don't end up neckless, all right, so that basically when you go into battle, you're going to keep, the head that you had when you started. So basically the gorget is there to give you some additional protection. A lot of battle stances, a lot of fighting in this era involves maneuvers that come from over the top, just because you've got the flow of gravity with you, which is going to give you that additional force. And so you want that extra reinforcement in the neck area, and that's largely what your gorget is going to do. Can you still turn your neck? Yeah, it's not impossible. It's certainly not great, as far as your flexibility, right? But obviously, you're going to pay for that to make sure that you're going to be protected. And so that's largely what your gorget is going to do. The last element of personal protection that we'll take a look at, right, is this right here for your noggin, right? Your helmet, right? This is what was referred to as a morion, and this is probably the most distinctive part of the conquistador's armor. When people see this, they automatically think, oh, that's a conquistador, right? Because they've seen this hat around, right? Especially with this, this broad brim on it, right? It's a very beautiful helmet. It's essentially an evolution of other kinds of helms that had come before it. Like, for example, the pot style helm. This one had the raised edges on it, which obviously are going to deflect blows. It also, of course, can have decoration, so you can kind of see, right, the nature in here. There's little, carvings into it. So if you're somebody of status, right, you can get a helmet that's going to have a little bit of extra stuff on it. Sometimes they would have plumes sticking out of them. But for the most part, the helmet performs the same vital function, and that's, of course, to protect your noggin, right, to protect your head. This helmet tends to be very, very effective, so much so that it was used for over 150 years. People in Jamestown, right, were equipped with these kinds of helms. They're what are called morions, okay? The morion helmet actually was not in wide use by the conquistadors, even though much of contemporary imagination imagines it with them. The reality is that much of what was written about the conquistadors was written later. So it was assumed at the time that was the most popular helmet. At that time was the morion in the 1600s. So it was assumed that conquistadors used it back then. It really begins to emerge on European battlefields really in the 1520s-ish. And then probably, you might have had some of the later conquistador expeditions that would have used it. And so it's not as commonly used as one would think. It was used by conquistadors, but you're not going to see it in the conquest of Mexico. You're probably not going to see it in the conquest of Peru. It's going to really date after those. And so it's kind of interesting that we think that, this is the helm that conquistadors wear when the vast majority of them did not. There were other kinds of helmets. Everything from the pot helm, the kettle helm, which was widely used, and they used other types as well. So the morion is more of a later invention, but it's something, of course, that even to this day inspires the imagination of the conquistador. Because of all of its raised edges, right, there's not a lot of places where you're going to get a direct impact. So any weapon is going to glance either off of the bill or it's going to come off of one of the raised sides, or you've got this extra reinforcement right here in the middle. All of those things, it's got padding on the inside that's going to give you some protection. So it really provided really good protection at a very low cost. And so it became known as the pikeman's pot, because especially with the 1600s, everybody was wearing these, and the 30 Years' War, for example, you're going to see morions fairly common. I mean, it's just because of the nature of how cheap they were, and they became kind of a style part as well. People like the style of the helmet as well. So that's the nature of the Morion helmet and why it's effective as well. All right, so that pretty much covers most of the personal armor. What we're going to be taking a look at next is the weaponry. So why is it that these Spanish conquistadors were able to defeat much larger groups of Indians? Let's take a look at their weapons and find out. One last piece of personal protective armor that you can see here is what's known as your greaves. So obviously soldiers could go into battle, right? They could have some leg protection as well. So in this instance, these are what are known as greaves. Greaves essentially are going to protect your knee, they're going to protect your shins. These are pretty vulnerable places that you can be struck. And so basically, of course, you got some nice metal reinforcement here. You still got, of course, pretty decent walking abilities, right? The greaves ultimately fasten in the back. Some are more gravity fitting. They're literally folded to the user and they fit around the calf. Obviously, I'm not somebody who can afford something that's so expensive. But for the most part, yeah, they can use straps as well in the back. We've seen examples of in historical museums of how they strap. But basically, these are what are known as greaves. They've been in use since ancient times to protect the shins, which are particularly vulnerable. And they still give you a certain amount of free range of movement. You could kick somebody with them too. It's probably going to hurt. But in general, these guys are going to be using a shield, right? The shield, of course, is going to protect a pretty good amount of the body. And so, of course, the one part that's going to be vulnerable, of course, is that part down there with the legs. So even the, somebody who's going like this, deflecting, you've still got that vulnerable spot down there. So largely, you've got these greaves in place that can help you tremendously when it comes to defending your legs. All right, so as promised, we already looked at the personal protection, so now we're going to take a look at the weapons of the conquistador. Everything from rapiers to crossbows to polearms. So we'll look at basically a sprinkling of the various weapons that conquistadors would have used in the New World, and we'll give some brief comparisons as to what the native peoples were using at this time. So obviously looking at the question, why were small numbers of Spaniards able to prevail over much larger groups of natives? But one of the answers to that question lies in the weaponry that they're going to use. So as we talked about, the kind of soldier that I represent is what is known as a rodolero, right? Rodoleros were so named because they would use this style shield called the rodella, right? Obviously, it's a good size shield. It's going to protect much of the body, right? And so obviously going into battle, you can use it to deflect blows, right? It's obviously got the rounded edges so that it's not going to be able to take weapons in a direct impact, which is good. And obviously because of its steel nature, it's going to be really good at being able to ultimately deflect most of the missile weapons that native peoples are going to throw at them, right? So anything from, for example, spears, atlatls, arrows, most of these things are going to be deflected by the shield itself because of the steel rim and the steel nature. It usually would have wood or leather on the inside to brace it. And so for the most part, this is going to be the primary form of personal protection that soldiers known as rodoleros will carry. In Europe, these guys were primarily used in what was called the tercio formation. Tercios were basically so named in Spanish because of threes. They would have essentially pikemen who would fight in the front rank. You would have musketeers who could ultimately switch if necessary or fire right at the enemy pikemen. They could also keep horsemen at bay. And then you had the last group of people who were your sword and buckler guys or your rodello guys. They would run in there with their swords and they would basically cut down pikes. And we'll talk about that when we get to the sword. So the shield was obviously an important part of what made this particular type of troop. And in fact, they were named after it because of their effectiveness. They worked really well against the Moors during the Crusades. And obviously these tactics are going to be brought to the New World to face off against the natives that are here as well. So that's the shield, right? Also known as the rodella, right? Used by conquistadors in the New World. Now, other weapons that we'll take a look at. One of the most important and iconic that most people like to discuss and look at is this, right? The sword, okay? Now, conquistador swords came in a variety of forms and functions. They're anything from broadswords that would have been very common on medieval battlefields to more slender rapier designs. All right, the conquistadors at this time were using real primitive rapiers, like the one that you see here. They're still going to be somewhat thick. They're going to be long, but they will be narrower than your typical broadsword, because at the time the steelmaking technology was getting better. One of the advantages of fighting the Moors was that the Spanish had figured out that their technology in ironworking was better than what they were using. So they could make steel that was much thinner and lighter, but yet was still going to pack quite a punch. And so this is where we start to see the first primitive rapiers that later are going to be very common during the Shakespearean era, for example, or later on in the 1600s when they become much more slender. But these are still somewhat thick because their original design was to cut pikes. So as we discussed before, these guys would run in during a push of pike on a European battlefield, and their job was largely to get in there with their shield and their sword, right? And they could deflect, right, pikes away, and then basically they can cut and slice those pikes down, all right? The advantage of that is if the enemy has 8-foot pikes and you have 16-foot pikes, then you now have an advantage. So when you go to push, right, you're going to have that extra 8 feet that's going to help you out. So in Europe, that's what they originally were used for, right? And as shock troops, right, to cut holes in the enemy line. In the New World, obviously the new peoples here are not going to have a whole lot of pikes. And if they do, they're going to be, personal use spears, not really the phalanx style tactics that you're going to see, for example, in much of European battlefields pioneered by the Swiss. So what the Spanish are largely going to be using these for is just to kill as many native peoples as possible. The thinness of the rapier allows it to be manipulated quickly, right? You can cut with it, right? Obviously, it's very good to thrust, right? Basically, soldiers could ultimately defend and cut at the same time, and it gave them a lot of versatility, right? That's going to allow them to be very successful. And so the nature of the shield and the sword are ultimately going to allow for you to be able to cut the enemy, and they're not going to have a whole lot of attacking windows and angles to get back at you with. So these things were very devastating against native peoples. They did not have steel or steel technology. Certainly they didn't have the means to stop it. So much of the arming jackets and things that you'll see people in the New World use, these things are going to cut right through them. So basically they're using very, very effective technologies as far as being able to be successful. So that's the nature of the Spanish sword, which is called the espada ropera, right, or the side sword. And that rodoleros would use these alongside with their shields to create advantages and ultimately to open up formations. And so this is one of the more savage aspects, right, of the conquistadors' kit, right? Everything from slashing wounds to stabbing. This thing's going to be very balanced and it's going to work for a variety of tasks. One last thing I wanted to point out about the Spanish sword, right, is you can see the nature of the handguard, right? So it's called a swept hilt rapier, right? It's got this hilt that protects the hand, right? It's got this little piece right there, right? That's going to ultimately give you some protection. It also looks cool. You've even got these little pieces here in the middle that are designed to trap swords. So when you go to block, for example, you could ultimately block somebody's sword. You can ultimately bring them down into a position where you can control them. And if your side weapon is a dagger, for example, you can go in and stab them or punch them with the shield or, whatever you want. You can then manipulate the enemy into doing what you want them to do. So the nature of the sword, the nature of its guard, very elaborate, very cool looking, very well balanced weapon. These were some of the primary weapons that soldiers would use in the New World. The next weapon we'll take a look at is the halberd. So we'll look at some pole weapons and some of the advantages of them as well. All right, so we're continuing our lessons here on the weapons of the conquistador. The next weapon that we're going to take a look at is a polearm that is known as the halberd. All right, this is a weapon that obviously has a tremendous amount of significance. It's very versatile, and it can be used in a variety of ways. The halberd itself is characterized really as 3 weapons in one. So you can take a look. You've got obviously your axe head, which can be used like an axe. You've got your spearhead, which can be used obviously to poke, to keep enemies at a distance. Right, and then lastly, of course, you've got the hook side, which can be used to grab mounted men and throw them into the dirt. So effectively, you can take it, right, if somebody's coming at you, right, you can grab them, you can pull them down, and then at that point, you can finish them off, right, with the halberd itself. So the advantage, of course, of this 3 weapons in one is also, of course, its size, right? Halberds tend to be 6-7 feet long. They could be longer depending on who's wielding it and what it's doing. But the advantage of this weapon is that you can keep the enemy at a distance, right? You can poke, you can prod, you can find openings in armor, which is what that little hook part is really good at doing. And it's really good at getting around plate armor, which was obviously the dominant armor of the day. So this was used very well on European battlefields. It's not going to be as awesome on Native American battlefields, simply because there's not a lot of armor. The armor they do wear is usually cotton. It's stuff that can be penetrated fairly easily. So this one isn't going to be as effective as you're going to see in Europe, but it's still going to be very effective at killing enemies, right? It's a cheap, no-nonsense solution, right, to being anti-cavalry defense. And even though the peoples of the New Worlds didn't have cavalry, all right, they still had soldiers that could be kept at a distance. And so what Cortez talks about and Bernal Diaz talks about is that halberds were largely used to keep the enemy at a distance so that musketeers could reload, so that crossbowmen could reload, so that they could fire, and so that their missile troops could ultimately inflict as many casualties as possible, particularly the gunners, who could inspire fear from their weapons. And so the combination of halberd and muskets and crossbows was ultimately going to be very deadly for the peoples here of the New World. And so, yeah, you have the halberd, right, which combines your 3 weapons in one, right? Obviously, the versatility of an axe, right, the poking abilities of a spear, and then lastly, of course, the ability to ultimately hook enemies and then finish them off on the ground. And so halberds could be used in a variety of ways to be a very effective tool that would have been used by the conquistadors here in the New World. The last of the major weapons we'll take a look at is the knife. And so we'll look at, let's say that you're a halberder and you break your halberd, and let's say that you lose your sword. What do you do then? Well, then you get your last ditch weapon, and we'll take a look at the functionality, right, of the Renaissance era knife next. All right, so let's say that all your weapons are broken, you're down to your last ditch effort. What do? Well, in this instance, conquistadors would carry on them a knife, right? So obviously the last of the weapons the conquistador are going to have, right, is a knife that looks somewhat like this. By the Renaissance era, knives were beginning to change again. Not that really knives have changed a whole lot through history. The form and shape have been somewhat similar for many years, but they really begin to change fundamentally during this era because of the nature of plate armor. Certainly these things aren't going to penetrate the plate, so they got to find ways around it. And so this is where you get stuff like this, right? These kinds of daggers that are called rondels, right? Because of their round shape, right? Basically, the nature of this is a very thin point, and it's very light. So the point is to be able to find those gaps in the armor, right? The neck, right? The armpits, right? The hips, right? Wherever you can find it, go up under the armor, find gaps in it, find holes in it somewhere, and manipulate in there, right? And stab in there. Obviously, this is a very effective weapon. Once people had been knocked down, for example, if they were wounded, this was a kind of finishing off weapon that was really good at being able to finish somebody who was already down. Certainly against people in the New World who didn't have super advanced armor, this thing would have killed just as readily as any of the other weapons that we talked about. The only decrease, of course, being that it has a smaller reach. But yeah, these rondel-style daggers, you can see it's got the hexagonal-style hilt on it, right? And then, of course, on the pommel side, same thing. It's got this kind of twistiness. So it's basically designed so that you really just twist that thing in there right when you stab somebody. And so as far as the nature of the knife, this was a very effective weapon that if all else failed, right, you could go down to. In fact, there's even knowledge, too, that people in the Renaissance would fight with this and the sword. So this was a good offhand weapon as well. So you might decide, right, that you're going to pull your sword out, right, and you're going to fight, and then essentially you would have this as your offhand weapon. So you could use the sword, right, to parry blows, and then you can obviously stab in here with the knife. So there's a lot of manuals, including Talhofer and others, that describe these different methods of being able to counter people who are fighting in this way. And it was very common. And so the reality is that soldiers have been familiar with the dagger. It could be used in a variety of ways. It could be manipulated to their advantage. And then, of course, they could use it to defeat downed opponents as well. So that's the nature of some of the advantages of using the rondel-style Spanish dagger. Okay, we'll go over the procedure on how to load and fire a crossbow. So essentially, As we discussed before, crossbows were very important weapons to the Spanish during their conquest of the New World. So we'll go over a little bit about the nature of how to load and fire these. First of all, the one that we'll be using here, right, obviously is a replica, right? I would never be able to get my hands on one that's an original, right? I'm on a poor teacher's salary anyway. But basically, this is a replica of the kinds of bows that are going to be used. So to load and fire them is a fairly simple procedure. It's pretty straightforward. This is why you see peasant armies being equipped with these, because you can train and equip guys with these pretty quickly. So for the most part, to load and fire the crossbow, you gotta be familiar with a few terms. Obviously, we've got the wood stock, right, which is what the bow sits on, right? You've got the tiller mechanism, you've got a firing mechanism in here, which essentially switches over when you pull the trigger, which is here, right? You've got a kind of primitive sight, right, that's basically here, right? And then in general, you've got a nice, twine rope. They're usually made out of hemp. They can make them out of women's hair. Throughout history, they've been made with all kinds of different stuff, but you've got essentially your bow string, which is going to be drawn back. You've got the stirrup, which essentially is what, just like if you're a cowboy or if you're somebody who rides horses, you're going to use this to put your foot in. And then essentially you're going to draw this back so that it ultimately locks into place. Once it does, you will load your device, right? The bow arms are largely going to provide the tension that is needed to fire. This again is a very small scale crossbow, so this isn't like the originals that were 2,500 pounds. This one doesn't require the use of a windlass or any of that kind of stuff. It's only about 100 pounds, so it's a pretty good workout still. But in general, this one can be drawn back by hand. And so basically, essentially, the archer either pulls the string back into position for each fire, or has a device like a windlass or something else that essentially would ultimately latch onto the string, and then you would have to crank it into position, and then eventually, once it gets ready, you would follow the same procedure. So those are some of the general guidelines as far as shooting a crossbow. What we're going to do at this point is actually go through a test firing. One last thing to keep in mind about crossbows, right? What they fire, all right? They're going to fire ammunition that's going to be much smaller than an arrow. It's what's called a quarrel, right? Or it's sometimes referred to as a bolt, all right? So they're going to fire more like a dart than what you're going to see in a traditional arrow. Sometimes it is fletched, sometimes it is not. In general, the fletching, can make a difference as far as making it travel further. Some decided to fire ones without it, but basically the impact is the same. I mean, these things are going to have tremendous armor piercing capabilities at close range. They're going to be very, very powerful. And so that's why I think armies tended to prefer to arm with the crossbow as it preferred to other tried and true methods, like, for example, the longbow, which required a lot of skill to use. The crossbow, is a little bit more forgiving in that regard. It fires on a much straighter trajectory. It's much flatter. And so tactics ultimately reflect this. And also, of course, you're not going to get as many shots off. As you'll see by pulling the bowstring back, and especially if you're using a windlass or a crank, you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 shots a minute. Whereas, a longbowman, somebody in 100 Years' War is going to be pumping out, as many as 10, maybe even 12. So you're not going to get as much firepower, but the weapons that you do put on target are going to make an awful impact. So without further ado, let's do a test fire. Okay, so we went over crossbow terminology. We talked about the nature of what a crossbow does. All right, now let's actually do a test fire. So without further ado, let's go through the presentation. So first of all, of course, you want to put your foot in the stirrup, right? You want to get it nice and comfortable. So let me back up a little bit so y'all can see. All right, so I've got my foot in the stirrup like this. All right, I want to pull the string back into position so that it locks. All right, once it's locked, and essentially at this point, I've got an armed bow ready to go. At this point is when you're going to put your ammunition in. So I've got my bolt that I'll basically put in here, make sure it's snug into the bolt string, and at this point it's ready to fire. And so again, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of stuff to do, but when you're under fire, of course, obviously the more repetition you have, the better. And this is in general how they're going to load. Again, if you've got a crank or you've got some kind of a windlass design, then you're going to have to obviously pull it into place with that device. This one, of course, is a smaller crossbow, so it's not as big a deal. So as you can see, it obviously makes a pretty big dent. I mean, this isn't even a super powerful crossbow, but obviously it's going to penetrate pretty deeply. This one, of course, if I was hunting deer, I would have missed just slightly off the lungs, as you can see here. But in general, if you hit a human being with this, it's still going to hurt. So the kind of shot you can see as far as deep as it goes in, right? Obviously you got that big point, right? And it's going to put a pretty good sized hole in the target. Certainly you're going to be bleeding from that. I don't know if it'll necessarily kill you, but you know, it's going to hurt. Again, and this is a low power crossbow as well. All right, so this completes our study of the Spanish conquistador as far as talking about the armor, the weapons, the accoutrements, and the historical context of what was going on, right? I hope all of you enjoyed it, especially those of you in my 1301, 1302 classes, even my World Civ classes as well. Again, I get the question frequently, you know, why do you do this? Well, number one, I do it because it's fun, I enjoy it. And number two, because again, I think that it's a lot easier if you can see it, that you can understand it, right? It's the whole motto that we have here, right? At Hands-On History, right? That we don't just learn history, we live it. So I think that by doing the reenactments, by showing you the different weapons and armor, I think that it makes it more real for you. And hopefully, you know, encourages you to do some research, hopefully maybe even go so far as to start a Spanish reenacting group or a conquistador or a medieval Renaissance group, right? Maybe join a HEMA group, right? There's lots of avenues to explore if you're interested in this era. And so I know, especially, you know, here in the States that, you know, especially when it comes to European reenacting, it's going to be few and far between in a lot of places. But, you know, obviously we have a lot of fun. There's a lot of cool things that can come out of this era. And it really helps to explain us as a people. So that does it for Hands-On History today as far as our study of the Spanish conquistador. Keep the conversation going. Feel free to leave comments, likes, etc. If you've got your own story that you'd like to share, feel free to do so. And for those of you that are part of my classes, right, thank you for tuning in, right? You will have assignment to be named later. And for those of you, of course, that are just tuning in for general information, thanks for stopping by. If you have other eras you want me to take a look at, make sure that you post them in the comments. I'll take a look at them, and hopefully if I have a limited budget. Again, I'm a poor public school teacher, but you know, if it's something that's feasible and something that I can do, then I'll for sure try to do it. In addition, I'll try to post some sources in the comments as well. So if you're interested in primary sources and looking up stuff, or in general, just trying to make me look like I'm totally full of shit, feel free to do so. I'll post those in there as well. So again, thanks for tuning in. This has been a production of Hands-On History, where we do not just learn history, we live it. See you guys. Yo, it's hot as balls in this thing, and I need a drink.
Good morning, Mr. Sloan. I trust that you are well, sir.
Yes, permit me a moment. A fine morning it is, Mr. Pemberton.
I must say I derive the utmost satisfaction from a day like this as delivered by the Almighty, sir.
It appears that Colonel Pettigrew, that blackguard of a man, has given you a lie, sir.
The Colonel and I have never partaken in anything but the most civil of discourse, so I might assume that his sentiments are misplaced, sir.
I think perchance, sir, that such an expression might be in direct relation to the recent debate in the Senate regarding the raising of tariffs on spirits.
Such a matter should not impede the civility demonstrated between two gentlemen. Please recount his choice words, sir.
Mr. Pemberton, on this occasion, has impertinently and inconsistently obtruded himself. He has acted as a puppet of a lying, worthless, drunken scoundrel who is now at war with and flatly contradicts and gives falsehoods.
Such evident barbarity shows a hyena-like thirst for public recognition, which has lowered him in the estimation of all good men of his state. Good morning, gentlemen. I trust that your return from the Senate was uneventful. Sir, the harshness of your words, the language unfamiliar to me, has done a grave injustice to my person. I can seek no other alternative than to demand satisfaction, sir.
Indeed, such a cowardly attack on this respectable man is beyond the bounds of proper behavior.
I have a thorough conviction that I cannot be so high as to accuse him of it without impunity.
It is to your satisfaction, Mr. Pemberton. I will act as a criminal second for the necessary change.
In this form, I can think of no greater alternative to settle such an impasse between two men of a sacred stand. And the matter is settled. Speak with my second, Mr. Swan. I bid you a good day, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fordham. I trust that you are well.
Indeed, I am, Mr. Swan. It's unfortunate Mr. Pemberton and the Colonel have come to such discourse. I would expect gentlemen of this stature to come to some amends.
I'm afraid that the harshness of the Colonel's words has deeply wounded Mr. Pemberton. The time for amends has passed.
He states such a fact. The Colonel has no memory of such insulting remarks.
I'm sure as both men feel as they would when their honor has been impeached or assailed upon.
Instead of the words of a public speaker, it's a punishment. Hear the noise of wailing cry.
I'm afraid that their task is of no consequence, that the resolutions have been reached, that there are no other acceptable measures that may be taken.
Very well. I'll take this message probably to the Colonel. However, I still wish that both gentlemen remain unscathed.
That's what the time will have to tell, Mr. Fordham. This location shall suffice, Mr. Pemberton. Political interference and all that shall be.
I thank you, Colonel, for your kind words, which are such a divergence from your remarks of days past.
I would at this moment propose a last-minute reconciliation, but I profess that effort would be in vain.
I have considered this proposal attentively and find within it nothing of the sincerity and honor that you profess to value.
The counting of the paces shall be 12. You will be permitted to fire after a count of 3. If satisfaction has not been achieved, additional fires may be granted.
They are.
The Honorable Physician Dr. Cooper shall be available if any bodily harm shall result. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Pemberton, your wounds are beyond my ability to care.
Permit me a moment, gentlemen, to speak with the Colonel.
Mr. Pemberton, I do renounce my barbarous ways. A gentleman of your stature deserves no such treatment.
Your remorse is duly noted and rightly placed, sir. I only hope that the Almighty may absolve us of our previous indiscretions.
You've been an honest servant with you in the Senate and on duty ground. You are a true gentleman, sir.
I trust that there is no greater debt between us, sir.
The matter has been settled and amends have been reached.
Indeed, they have. At a good cost.
Right now we have our 4 cannoneers getting ready to set up. we have the gunner. He's making sure everybody's ready to go on the left-hand side over here. He's also making sure that there's nobody in the way of the line of fire. He's asking all the cannoneers to get to their posts now.
Solid shot! Go!
They're loading the cannonball at this point. We don't actually use a real cannonball. We have blank fire, so so you won't see anything flying out of this thing today.
Oh shit. Sorry.
The gunner is looking downrange to see that there's a target in line of fire.
Ready!
They're loading the fuse.
Fire!
And there you have it.
Hi, welcome. Hi, how are you?
Good. I just set the tea here.
Oh, such lovely tea. What kind of tea are we having today?
Earl Grey today.
Oh, nice. I'm going to go ahead and enjoy myself a nice cup of Earl Grey.
Have you heard the news? I just read the paper. Look at these amendments.
Oh, my dear. No.
After all we've tried to do to help them, our cause was set aside.
We need to do something. How could they bypass us? We had served, we've been fighting to pass our right, our voice to be heard for many years. When are they going to change for us? How did they pass us by? They allowed blacks to vote before us white women? Are we not anybody? Do we not matter? We need to meet. We need to change this.
We need to set a meeting so that way we can all get together and make sure that the women's vote comes first next.
Let's do that.
Can you believe we're here in New York City? The first Seneca convention ever.
Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. We finally get to have a voice, a woman's voice. We're gonna go out and fight. We get to meet Susan B. Anthony and Miss Cat herself. I'm so excited.
This is our turn.
It's our turn, women's turn, finally. Hi, today we're going to talk to you about the suffrage movement and why it's so important. It started in 1848 and lasted until 1920. It was a movement that was fighting for women's voting rights. It was a decades-long fight with both activists and reformers, men, women, black and white. It was 100 years to actually win the vote, if you really think of all the years that they were actually asking for the vote. But they didn't actually get tough and start demanding the change until the Seneca Falls Convention with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, who demanded change and asked for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment that was later changed before passing to the 19th Amendment.
This was a 2-day convention where the women came together and decided they needed to find a format where they would be heard. so many times that they've helped with the other civil rights movements, and where the women's right to vote was set to the side. So they came up with the Declaration of Sentiments, which had the 12 resolutions, and they actually formatted it in a similar fashion as the Declaration of Independence, so that way they not only heard but kind of respected for having the capability to come up with something that was just as good, and they were able to express themselves through legislation in the same manner.
And you had famous men such as Frederick Douglass, a black man himself, who, after achieving the vote, didn't forget about those women who fought beside him, joining these women as an activist and a reformer himself to help achieve the vote. It was a wonderful thing, a powerful thing, and it changed the world we know today.
Okay, so in this part, we're kind of talking about some of the obstacles the suffrage movement had to endure. A lot of the problems came from what was going on in the current events at that time. You know, we had this group of women that was trying to fight for a right to vote, and inevitably, it didn't even really become as strong until they joined in with the women's temperance movement.
Exactly. This temperance movement was basically calling out the liquor industries, telling them how they're destroying the home. And as they united the liquor industry, for example, as you see here, they feared that if women were to gain the vote, that it would destroy their industry. So the passing of the 18th Amendment basically caused prohibition. They feared if women were to keep the vote, that it would continue. They would never be done or be able to get rid of the 18th Amendment. Think of the population of women. How many women do we have in the world? How many voters would we have? That would be about what, 50% of the population, just give or take, not including the liquor industry. Another one was
the child labor laws, and a lot of the women may have changed that because as a mother, they wouldn't want their children getting hurt, and they wanted to ensure their safety while they were working. And a lot of these manufacturers didn't want to put in the money to improve their factories.
Oh no. And of course, pay the wages as well. Women were still lowest paid. Not only would they put in the time, lowest paid, they didn't want their children out there risking their destroying their household. They also feared, many voters feared that if women got the vote too, that women would be basically gaining too much power, have too much say. It would change their households. You know, you would have a woman with outside the house, more into politics. Who knows where they would have gone, you know, back then. Look where women are today, because women things have changed. They feared that. They feared that advancement. They were afraid of what would have happened, how things would have changed. They didn't know, and they were scared of it. So basically that. Come on, let's go.
All right. We will be heard.
We will be heard. I'm tired of being quiet. Let's make some noise. Break stuff. Hello. Today we're going to talk to you continue talking to you about the suffrage movement and basically what the difference is between a suffragist and a suffragette, which they're very similar. They were both fighting for the suffrage movement, but they had different campaign methods.
The suffragists preferred a more macro approach. They were educated, and they came from middle class and upper class homes. They were property owners, and they wanted a more peaceful protest. So they would go to legislation and the local government, even state governments, and try to appeal through the laws of the land.
And the suffragette basically took a little bit more aggressive approach. They kind of got a little bit more tired of waiting for the movement to happen. So they decided to be heard more dramatically. So they started breaking, damaging property. Signs are great. Both parties did signs, you know, they're great. They would still have their signs, but they would get into they would continue with their signs very loudly. Ladylike was thrown out the window. They didn't care so much to be ladylike. They also went on a hunger strike, which later caused them to be force-fed in jail. They were both arrested multiple times. Both suffragists and suffragettes were arrested, violently arrested. And basically that sums up what the difference is between the two. Thank you.
Okay, so in this section, we're going to talk about the symbolism for the women's suffrage movement. And the National Women's Party actually put out a publication in December of 1913 where they explain the colors of the flag that is right behind me. It says, purple is the color of loyalty, constancy to purpose, unswerving steadfastness to a cause. White, the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of our purpose. And gold, the color of light and life, is as the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving.
Well, as she was explaining the colors of the movement, the women's suffrage movement, it was really important to have these colors and the symbols to represent, because every single one of those colors were added onto almost everything they had that represented their flyers, everything they wore, from their pins to their sashes. Also their flag. And why their flag was so important, because it represented that cause. Alice Paul was one of the ones that adapted activists for this cause. They designed this flag and the stars to represent every state that was supporting the passing of the 19th Amendment. So every state that ratified the 19th Amendment, they would hand sew that star onto the flag. Of course, there wasn't that many states at the time to ratify it. They were constantly fighting and changing. So as they were changing and persuading those states to ratify, they would add that star. So it was a huge blessing. It was a huge change. And it was representation of everybody that is united to the cause. Hi, today we're going to talk to you basically about passing of the 19th Amendment and how it impacted the suffrage movement. This is what they were looking for. This is the fight that they were fighting for so long. Now, as you know, the suffragists were going state by state. Mostly the West states were ratifying the 19th Amendment. They were struggling to get some of the Southern states to actually pass the 19th Amendment. So the last state that they were in hopes to pass this 19th Amendment was Tennessee. They needed 36 states to pass this. At the time, they had just received the support of President Woodrow Wilson. He gave the support. Now, as we say, what do we say about Woodrow Wilson? Did he want to give that support?
No, not really. I don't think he wanted to, but unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson suffered a severe stroke and he became ill. And so his wife, Edith, and they actually write a book on it. It's Madam President, and they say that she was actually one of the first women presidents because of the 25th Amendment, and he was ill at the time. So essentially she was helping during his sickness. And that's actually when the 19th Amendment was signed by President Wilson.
And also he feared his reputation, his bad publicity. You know, he didn't want to leave the White House with bad publicity on having his name battered, right? So you have to remember that. So he didn't want that bad publicity. Now, not only did he give the support, but right before he gave the support, Congress and the Senate and the House, all of them were already approving and ratifying the amendment. So they were down to Tennessee, the 36th state, which became the War of the Roses. As you see, the monument behind us is support of some women that were supporting and fighting for the passing of the 19th Amendment.
One of the other interesting facts about this time period, and they're in Tennessee, and why they called it the War of the Roses is they were using different colored roses to represent what side they actually supported. So the red, if you wore a red rose, it actually meant that you did not support the passing of the women's right to vote. But if you wore a yellow rose, that actually meant that you wanted the 19th Amendment to pass.
And of course, as you were going there to vote, despite what you were going to say, they already knew what or how you were voting because you were already wearing the rose. You were already wearing it on your dress coat, right? So there's a funny story or a sweet story, as we would say, especially mothers, right, of a young senator named Harry T. Byrne, who was one of the last ones to get his vote. And he was the tie-breaking vote, going on wearing a red rose pinned to his jacket coat, walking up there late because he was reading a letter from his mother who basically stated for him to support the women, right? And that his vote does matter. Now, his reputation could have been on the line, his job. He was a young senator. So as he was going there with his beautiful red rose, he stepped up and he said, I support the amendment. And everybody was shocked. Famous pictures, a story. He wasn't the only one, though, that changed his mind that day, but he was the tiebreaker. And being a tiebreaker, you always remember that tiebreaker, right? You always remember him. So it was great. It was a great story. It passed. Now, this changed the whole United States. It changed all women, men, everybody. Now we're going to talk to you about some of the changes that happened and occurred after the passing of the 19th Amendment, you would think everything was glory and everybody got what they wanted, but it wasn't quite like that. So let's talk about some changes that happened and things that didn't change, maybe that we may have thought that they would have changed.
So, right after, women got the vote, of course, I mean, everyone's excited. We finally did it. We got our right to vote. And that was liberating. It was wonderful. So, a lot of times the women, they started wearing pants. They started feeling independent, that they could make their own decisions. They tried to go for different types of jobs and not just secretaries or housewives. They looked for trying to get an education.
Oh yes, that was huge. Education, but not just being a teacher. Some of them started challenging some of the men fields, such as like being an engineer. Fashion industry was already being pushed before the passing of the 19th Amendment, and then really targeted after. You had women wearing darker shades of colors, makeup, and clothes, cutting, like she said, cutting the hair. Some of them were scared to cut their hair, so they would cut the front of their hair and have it long in the back, which is kind of like, you would think, ew, but they did it. It was like a challenge. Hats started really, really big, and they got smaller, right? So things like that started changing. Big thing that started happening too was shaving of the legs. It started before the passing of the amendment, but more and more women started accepting it. In fact, it made headlines. Stupid women are cutting their legs and having to go to the doctors because they're cutting their legs so much, right? Because they're showing skin now. They're showing legs. They needed to shave their legs so that they can be pretty for when their legs are being shown, right? Smoking and drinking. More women started taking on a lot of smoking and drinking. They took on more responsibilities, so I guess they felt felt that they could, right? The men were doing it. So let's talk about some of the things that didn't change that you would have thought that should have changed, right? Such as,
well, definitely pay. And I think that's something that we're still dealing with today. There are some women that are able to make more money than men. However, there is a disparity between the two genders. Most men make more than women, even if they're doing the exact same job. And this is something that we're still, equal rights, equal pay. We still hear that today, but it didn't. And right away, the gender roles at home didn't change either. The women wanted all these liberations, but they were still responsible for cleaning, cooking, being submissive to their husband while they were trying to be dependent, taking care of the children, and it wasn't easy.
Which led to, what do you think? Divorce rate started increasing, like, bye-bye, see you later, I don't have time for you, just joking. But the divorce rate started increasing, right? But let's think about it. So it peaked really in the 50s and 70s. But think about it. They're taking all these responsibilities. They don't feel the need to have somebody weigh them down. If they're not going to be an equal partner and treat them equally, some women just didn't want to deal with it. Or, men were used to the women bowing down, right, to them, and women were feeling more entitled. So things were changing. Things have changed. There's a lot more women in elected positions today as well. Things were just gradually changing, as Ms. Erica talked about how pays changed. Women did and still do fight for higher wages today, or equal pay. A lot of it's not really something that we're still dealing with. But back then they were really dealing with it. They were happy that they did receive a paycheck, happy that they were able to have a vote, but it didn't justify not having that equality as men, doing the exact same work, that same labor, right? They should receive that. Household duties, like Erica mentioned, like you know, if I'm going to have to work a full-time job, you should have to split some of these chores with me. And it just wasn't like that. They were expected to still do all those duties at home. Sorry, gotta get to clean those toilets, gotta go do the groceries. I mean, everything that they were responsible before going to work, they were having to do. So even gaining the vote didn't take any of those changes away. So their daily lives, their responsibilities, the way we look at women, and you know, you automatically judge them, or you automatically like that's a woman's job or that's a woman's duty. That part hasn't changed and still doesn't change in many of our lives today. That's basically it, other than you wanted to talk about this beautiful picture here, right? It's a great image of a woman basically saying we can do it.
And she was actually an important symbol. Rosie the Riveter, she stood for, you know, the women who took over during World War II. A lot of the men had to go to war, and that did help the women in some ways, where they got the independence because a lot of the men were gone, and they took on factory jobs, they took on mechanic jobs, engineering jobs. But unfortunately, when the men came back from the war, the women were expected to go back home, and I think some of that had to do with the increase with the divorces as well.
Yes, they can do anything that a man can do. That's basically what it was. It was that representation, that symbol,
Right.
that women stood for and about. Well, hopefully you liked the lecture, and see you next time. Support the cause, please. It's time. Support the cause.
Women's rights. Women's rights. It's time for a change.
On September 1st, 1939, Europe was thrust into a massive war that would encompass the entire world. Initially, it would encompass Poland, but it would very quickly expand to the rest of the world in many different forms. So this was a reaction certainly to Germany expanding into many of the surrounding areas, to include Austria, as well as Czechoslovakia. And then Adolf Hitler, a chancellor of Germany itself, would test the waters a bit by thinking he could take Poland as well without confrontation. However, Great Britain as well as France would not let that happen. They would resist, and they declared war on Germany. As a result, they were prepared for their war. Poland would fall very quickly to Germany, but also on their eastern front, the Soviet Union would also join in on this war by taking half of Poland. This was an agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union in the previous year. However, Great Britain and France would prepare for the oncoming conflict. This would result in Great Britain taking the front in Belgium as well as parts of France, and France, of course, taking some of the southern border. Germany would finally take its offensive in May of 1940, and it would very, very quickly, to the surprise of everybody, take France out of the conflict in June of 1940. This would result into the retreat of British soldiers as well as some French soldiers over to Great Britain, to a very famous event called the evacuation of Dunkirk. This would leave only Great Britain to tackle Germany, at least at this point of the war. Great Britain is going to prepare, and Dunkirk is certainly going to allow them to have the manpower of 300,000 soldiers to prepare for the defense of Great Britain. During the Battle of Britain, which was primarily an air war, although there were some naval forces, Great Britain was able to fight off the German fighters and bombers. As a result, they are able to continue the fight even further, and thus launching their campaigns in North Africa to prevent Germany from taking the oil fields in the Middle East. The British involvement in North Africa would eventually also bring in the Americans, not only supplies, but also military troops, certainly after the Pearl Harbor attacks, and then shortly afterwards, Germany would declare war since they had an alliance with Japan. And as a result, now the Americans are going to be involved. Over the course of the next several years, Germany would also get involved in the Soviet Union by invading in June of 1941. As a result, what is going to happen is certainly all of Europe is embroiled in this war, but also the British are embroiled in conflict in Southeast Asia, certainly around Australia and New Zealand, against the Japanese as well. Over the course of the next few years, the British are going to be involved, certainly, as was mentioned before, North Africa, fighting Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and with the help of the Americans, would be able to defeat him. And then they would move their campaigns into Sicily and Italy to provide a second front against Germany to help out the Soviet Union. In the years later, they would then also launch the very famous invasion D-Day with the Americans, and they would invade the beaches of Normandy, and this would be split between the Americans, the British, and the Canadians to provide another front against Germany. And this certainly, without question, is going to result in the beginning of the end of Germany. However, much of the situation of Germany had declined, and it was already pretty much a said and done deal that Germany was not going to last at that point. In a series of campaigns, the British will be involved in Operation Market Garden. They would also continue to move towards Germany in subsequent years, and Germany would finally surrender on May 8th, 1945. Now this presentation is going to focus on how well equipped the British soldiers were, what their experience was like in these many campaigns, whether you're looking at Dunkirk or North Africa, Sicily, Italy, or the campaigns in France, Belgium, and then later Germany. Much of these discussions will be relevant also to their campaigns in Southeast Asia, surrounding Australia, New Zealand, getting into Burma, which is very close to what is now India. So let's take a look at what the British soldier was equipped with, what the campaigns were like as far as a common soldier is concerned. Hello and welcome. I'm representing a British soldier from World War II. You might see this as being very familiar to World War I. You might even guess this might be a World War I soldier, but there's some slight differences, and so I'll go and explain some of those differences. Some of the experience of the British soldiers in World War I, for example, they had a very good uniform, very adaptable to the warfare that they were experiencing. Certainly they could not predict that it was going to be trench warfare for much of the war. They thought it was going to be a very mobile warfare and something completely different than what had happened. They thought it was going to be very similar to some of their previous experiences in war, like Boer Wars. However, their uniform was adaptable to that situation. And over the course of the years of the Great War or World War I, there were slight modifications. So after the war, once they tried to determine and figure out what to change, there wasn't a whole lot of differences. So for example, the helmet itself, it worked fairly well in World War I, and so as a result, they didn't change it. There was a few different adjustments, like what you see with the attachment points right under the chin, but for the most part, its general design worked pretty well in World War I, so therefore it wasn't broken, therefore they didn't fix it. However, after World War II, they'll make some more adjustments but nevertheless, that's a conversation for another time. So as a result, the helmet's going to stay the same. Much of the actual dress of the uniform itself will remain fairly similar, but they're going to make a few adjustments due to their experiences in World War I. One of those experiences is they recognized that in the future, that there was going to be more mechanized type of warfare. So they had introduced the tank during World War I, mainly in 1917. There were some prototypes in 1916, but they were certainly playing around with mechanization in World War I. And so as a result, they adapted their uniform for that future war. Now, certainly they didn't know in the 1920s what World War II was going to look like, but they started to incorporate a lot of different pockets to adapt to that particular situation. So on the pants, for example, which you can't see very well, but the pants itself, they put pockets, one designated for the maps for the troops. So if you were in the infantry, if you were in the tanker brigade, or any other sort of ground forces, you have the same uniform. And so this is going to be very easy, certainly once we get to World War II, very easy to mass produce and manufacture, and it's going to be used by a lot of different troops. You're not going to have to change it based on the branches per se. So as, for example, they could put the map, so that's the tankers, that's the pilots, that's the infantry. Other pockets, they could put other certain items, so paperwork, or maybe they can put rounds or other different equipment that they may foresee and have a use. And so you have these flaps for maybe pens or other different paperwork, other different items, compasses, et cetera, that might help them navigate the world around them. So that's one of the major changes. They're also going to make a major change here. So their harness that's going to hold all of their gear, it was a lot of different webbing that got very complex very quickly. So they tried to clean that up a little bit. So there's a lot of crisscross patterns, small pouches on either side, which worked in World War I, but they felt that they could improve upon that. And that's what they did. And so they have their general belt, and the real innovative thing that the British did during World War II, and certainly the years prior to World War II, is they made a harness or a system that could be very modular, meaning that you could put parts in, take parts out, and adapt it for the situation or mission that you're going on. So you start off with your basic belt, and then you're certainly going to have these shoulder rests that you can start attaching bags like what we see here. And so you can also, some troops might have a big bag, which was very typical across the infantry themselves. I'm not wearing it currently, but you would attach it on to these little hooks right here. And that's where you're going to have your food supply, your shaving kit, any sort of items that you would need for your day in and day out. Not necessarily combat related. And then you're going to have these pouches here that's going to hold ammunition. And I'll get into that a little bit further. But more importantly, on one side, you're going to have a water bottle. Now, in the early part of the war, so we're talking 1940, 1941, and certainly dipping into 42, you're generally going to have a water bottle on your right side. When we start getting later in the war, 1943, 44, 45, they're going to start adapting these water pouches to have them on both sides. The British recognized that water was essential, especially in the many combat areas they were fighting in, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and then if you look at the Pacific theater, the jungle environments of Burma, water is going to be essential. So they started issuing 2 water bottles per unit, or per infantry soldier. And then on the left side, very, very typical, you're going to have your bayonet. And I'll demonstrate that here in a minute when we start talking more about the weapons. Now, as far as other different equipment they could attach other different pouches and bags. Some might be a little bit bigger, that might be on the side, for example. They're going to have a gas mask due to their experiences in World War I. Gas was certainly a big threat. They didn't use it a great deal in World War II, thankfully, but that option was available. And so all these different bags could be attached, and as a result, it made a very streamlined system. And this system was so good that many British troops will be continuing to use it into the 1960s, and you're going to start seeing it be phased out in the 1970s. So any veterans out there, military veterans, no matter which country that you served in or from, you're going to see some of the origins of modern sort of systems you may or may continue to be using based on this system right here. And certainly the Americans are going to try to adopt some of this during World War II as well as afterwards, although they learned quite a bit from the British during World War I as well, based on the equipment itself. All right, so what's in these pouches itself? It's not necessarily going to be only ammunition. Typically, the British soldier is going to have a bandolier for ammunition for their rifles. So I'll kind of talk about the rifles here in a minute. So one aspect that's going to be very important for the British infantry, is going to be quite unique as opposed to many other different groups, is they're going to have magazines very much like this for a Bren light machine gun. The Bren light machine gun was a little ahead of its time. Certainly the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, they had an idea of a light machine gun. If the Americans, you're looking at Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, but it was quite heavy and not exactly the use that we're going to see with the Bren light machine gun. The Germans, they had an MG34 and then later the MG42, but that was still quite heavy. But they're still kind of adapting those systems for their infantry tactics. The Bren was light enough that one soldier could carry it and move it around. It's still heavy, no question about that, but it was far easier to move around on the combat field. And these 30-round magazines lends itself to have more ammunition than the BAR, but also it's light enough and you can offer accurate firepower onto the enemy. And so as a result, this is going to be the main baseline for many infantry squads or sections during this period of time for the British. So you're going to send that fire down range. Hopefully it's accurate. You're going to keep the heads down of the enemy, and that is going to allow your infantry to maneuver, get around, take out the enemy, however they may be. So the Bren light machine gun is going to certainly have a series of magazines with that soldier, but every single infantry soldier in that squad or section is going to have at least 2 of these on each person. So when they're running out of ammunition per se, the Bren light machine gun in this case, I can, for example, toss a magazine towards that particular individual. And so therefore, the entire section can keep that fire on the enemy, and hopefully those soldiers will be able to use that to their advantage and take out the enemy and move on. So that's one key factor with the Bren light machine gun. So this, like I said, is a little ahead of the time because if you look at what's going to happen in the 1960s and 70s, the Soviets are going to adopt this with their later models or inspiration from the AK-47 or AKM, and they're going to adopt a light machine gun in a very similar fashion where their light machine guns can use the same sort of magazines and ammunition as the regular infantry, and the Americans will adopt this in the 2000s, so the M27. So the same basic concept, but the British were attempting to do this in the 1940s, and it worked out pretty well for them across the field. So let's take a look now at a Bren light machine gun and what that whole system is all about. This video clip comes from the YouTube channel Bloke on the Range. So if you're interested in historical firearms, check out that channel afterwards, and I'm sure you'll be entertained and learn quite a bit. So let's transition into that clip.
When employing automatic fire, as here, it is best to fire it in bursts of 4 or 5 rounds. The necessary volume of fire is thereby produced, accuracy can be maintained, and excessive expenditure of ammunition is avoided. The normal rate of fire is about a magazine a minute, and it is important to remember that there are only 24 magazines in the section.
All right, now let's move right along after this Bren gun discussion to look at what the other pouch is going to be carrying. Yes, you could carry some ammunition, but as I said previously, the bandolier is typically going to be where you're going to carry your main stash of ammunition. However, many did put ammunition into their other pouch that was not carrying the Bren light machine gun magazines. In addition, you might be carrying some hand grenades with this pouch as well. So that could be fragmentation grenades, like what I have in here. Like I said, some ammunition might be carried. There we go. Here we go. So here's your regular fragmentation grenade from this period of time. There's many different variations of hand grenades during this time. And the Americans and British will be working together, and much of their hand grenades are going to look very, very similar. And in many cases, they might interchange whatever was available. So you have fragmentation grenades like what we have here. There will also be smoke grenades as well, or phosphorus. As there might be, this might be full of maybe two. And typically two is going to be what's carried by each infantry soldier. The British ones, the Mills grenade, is going to be a little flatter, or fatter rather, a little bit bigger. But then you also have these skinny type of grenades as well. So let's transition to the main fighting rifle for the British. So that's what we have here. And so the British is going to, at this period of time, they had several different marks or versions. This is going to be the Lee Enfield rifle. Typically, they would have in mass production the number 3 Lee Enfield rifle. This is what was used in World War I. There was a few modifications to make it a little more streamlined for future wars. But by 1939, right when the war started, they started to make some modifications, and they put into production the number 4 Mark I. And there's going to be several different versions of this throughout World War II as well. And so what we have here, the main point for the British was to streamline this to make these rifles faster. They were in the midst of the war, certainly by 1939. So they want to make a bunch of rifles really quick and not have the very tedious time constraints and really taking a long time to make the perfect rifle. They knew they didn't have time for that. And so as a result, we made some very good modifications to the Lee Enfield rifle. One of those features is the barrel itself is going to be free floated, meaning that nothing is touching the barrel itself. Everything is going to be adhered to the receiver, and that is going to increase accuracy. So in World War I, typically you're going to have man-sized targets, about 4 or 5 inch group at 100 yards, and this is going to narrow it down closer to roughly 3. So that's a very good progress. And they had quite a few problems with accuracy during World War I, so they wanted to fix that. In addition to that, we now have the safety over on the other side, so you just flip it. Very easy to engage or disengage. They got away from single round shot. What that meant was you had a lever. There would actually, if you fired one round, it would not load the other round. They found that to be quite annoying, frustration, and so as a result, they got rid of it. So that's going to speed up the production of this rifle. In addition to that, we also had a ladder sight, which was featured In World War I, they kind of streamline it a little bit. You can see it a bit better there. But this is going to make it so you could, if you had a known distance, you could shove it up to 200 yards, 300 yards, 400, 500, and so on and so forth. Most combat is going to take place within 300 yards, but that's going to be something that everyone's going to start to figure out during World War II and make adjustments from there. So the maximum range of this ladder sight is going to be 1,300 yards, far more reasonable than the 2,000 that is going to be featured on the German weapons. But nevertheless, even 1,300 yards is going to be a tough shot to make with any rifle, much less one of these. But one of the main features is the smoothing of the bolt itself. And so one of the famous features of the Lee Enfield is how smooth the bolt actually is. So it's very, very quick, and that is going to be able for the British soldiers to fire quite quickly. So if they're in an emergency situation, close quarter combat, for example, it's going to be very quick and easy to squeeze off a few rounds at the enemy, wherever they may be. It also features a magazine, which they're going to be able to hold 10 rounds rather than 5 rounds, which you typically see in, for example, the American Springfield 1903 rifle, which is being phased out in this period of time by the Americans. They will be introducing M1 Garand, which is a semi-automatic rifle, certainly an advantage to what anyone else had at that time for rifles. But the Mauser, the Mosin Nagant from the Russians, are all going to have 5-round internal magazines. So how you would load this weapon, I'll grab that ammunition that I have here. It is attached to a clip. The reason why we call this a clip is you're clipping on the rounds to a piece of metal. So this piece of metal is going to fit into this charging station right here. And so it fits right down there, and then you're going to shove the rounds into the internal magazine here. A magazine, we call this because it has a metal follower that pushes the rounds up to be loaded into the barrel itself. So 10 rounds of these, very effective, very good round. No complaints about the .303 British round that was being fired throughout World War II, and this round will continue after World War II as well. Now, you might say, why are we using clips instead of magazines? Well, magazines were quite expensive at that period of time to produce, and they didn't quite trust giving a magazine to every single soldier, and we have thousands upon thousands of soldiers out in the field. That's going to be a very costly endeavor. So as a result, they stuck with having a magazine within the rifle, and then using strip clips, and that's what pretty much everyone's going to do across the world. No matter what country you're a part of, the Americans, the Russians, the British, obviously, and the Germans, they're all going to use these stripper clips. All right, so just to demonstrate how quickly that you can actually do this bolt is typically, if you've ever been hunting, you're going to pull the trigger, and then you're going to rack the slide, and down you go, and you use your index finger to pull the trigger again. While the British, if you were in a close quarter combat, you need a lot of rounds on target, you're going to grip the handle in your palm of your hand, and you're going to use your middle finger to actually pull the trigger itself. And so your hand never actually leaves the bolt. And so fire quite quickly and quite accurately if you have a good prepared position. All right, so that's Lee Enfield. I will demonstrate some of the other different features. So we have the bayonet. So once again, keep in mind that they are trying to manufacture these as quickly as possible. This is not a knife or a short sword type of bayonet that you would see in World War I. Instead, it's just a long bar that's been sheared at the tip to make a sharp point. Much, much quicker than instead of fashioning a blade itself. You just take a bar, shear it off to a point, and then it goes down the line. So much, much quicker to actually produce these, and this is what they really needed. Were there many different bayonet engagements throughout World War II? For the British, not so much, but it was still a backup weapon. They used this for, you could put, something that you had hunted, like a squirrel or a rabbit, put it on this, cook it over the fire. So they had uses like that. They would also use this quite typically for actually looking around for mines. So if they had an idea that there might be a minefield up ahead, and they could just poke in the ground without letting it go off, and then they could find these mines and avoid these mines. So there are multiple uses for this piece of equipment. We have another piece of equipment right here. There we go. Twist this on real quick. There you go. Now this might look like a silencer, suppressor, or something like that, but it is not. It is, the dead giveaway is the site right here. This is a grenade launcher. Quite a few grenade launchers were used in World War I, but not very effectively. And so as a result, in the interwar period of the 1920s and 30s, they're going to further develop this idea because there was the idea that trench warfare might occur. And so if you could have grenade launchers that you could launch in the air, and the explosive rounds could land on the heads of the enemy in the other trench, they saw that as being very, very useful. So the British and the Americans and Germans and Soviets are all going to develop their own versions of grenade launchers. They're going to be far more effective. What you're seeing here, what you might be able to see here is that sight there. This will go roughly to 100 yards. Give or take. You could probably make it go a little further, but the accuracy of it or the predictability of where it's going to go is probably going to be lost at that point. But it was a tool to take out machine guns, for example, and even anti-tanks. So there's going to be several different rounds, just like several different grenades that could be used. So one example is we have this rifled grenade. So what you would do is you would put it on. All right, here, the fins down here are going to stabilize the actual round itself, and up here is going to be the shaped charge. Now, you could actually change and take these two pieces apart, and you could pick maybe a fragmentation warhead, or maybe a smoke warhead, or an anti-tank warhead. And so you have some options there. So before going out on combat, you might say, okay, we need a couple smoke, a couple frag, and they would have several separate pouches for this different equipment too. And so as a result, the British found that anti-tank rifle grenades was actually more effective than some of the other devices they had. So some of their anti-tank equipment, like the Piat, was very difficult to use. And so as a result, they would find weak spots on tanks and try to use something like this on those tanks themselves. So there are a lot of equipment that is being developed at this time and used very, very effectively. Now, in opposition, we have the Mauser. So this is going to be used by the Germans during World War II. A longer version was used by the Germans in World War I. It is bolt action, very much what we saw with the Lee Enfield. But this is a very robust, very durable, and reliable rifle. You can see here we got a bayonet, which is fashioned in a knife, as opposed to what we see with the spike bayonet that we saw in the Lee Enfield. This is going to take quite a bit of time to manufacture, and much of the German equipment is going to lag behind because the Germans are looking for perfection when they don't really have the time and effort to really perfect every single piece of equipment. They're They're going to kind of get that message by 1943-44, but by then they're already losing the war, and they're having bombs dropped on them by the British, the Americans, and then certainly by late 44-45, now the Soviets. So that's going to be a bit of an issue for them. But nevertheless, it was a good design. It was bolt action. The Germans themselves are going to have 5 rounds, as mentioned, within the magazine that is, hidden behind this wood here. It is a rather large round, an 8mm Mauser round, which is much bigger than what you're going to see the Americans, the British, the Soviets use. It's hard hitting, which, at the same time can really rough up your shoulder if you're firing a lot of those rounds. But one of the advantages that the Germans are going to find with this is is really robust, very durable, and so it is one of the most reliable designs and easy to make designs that has ever been developed, at least for bolt-action rifles. And so your typical hunting rifle is actually going to use the Mauser system, and many countries are going to adopt this system. The Americans with the Springfield 1903, the Russians with the Mosin Nagant. The British certainly looked at this design and they made their own decision with their design, a little bit different. So that's just kind of what the British do. So it is a very good design, but it was at this period of time becoming quite dated. They did have semi-automatic rifles, but they weren't very reliable, and so you're not going to see widespread production of those semi-automatic rifles. They're basically going to adopt the Russian design, but much of those rifles were built under poor condition, and so they're not going to last either too. So it's certainly a great rifle, but it's a little bit behind the times. Certainly on par with capability as a Lee Enfield, because the Germans are going to develop grenade launchers, certainly have the bayonet. They're going to develop scopes that you can fit on top of here as well, and the British will do the same thing with the Lee Enfield. However, much of their sniper program won't develop until after the war too. So very good design, easy to maintain, easy to take apart, and it does do the job. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, it's not going to quite work out for them. So bottom line, that's the equivalent of a British soldier at this period of time. There is more equipment out there, certain bags and other different equipment that is available for the British soldier, but this is typically what the British soldier is actually going to have and contain, and this is going to be his everyday life. It was, in comparison to other different forces, quite comfortable. Yes, the Germans had highly refined uniforms. They were very nice uniforms, but once again, just as we certainly had the discussion about the Mauser and many of the different German weapons, they really couldn't afford to spend that much time, and they had a lot of different projects all at the same time. The British recognized we need a rifle, we need to streamline it, we need a lot of these. Same thing with the uniform. There were modifications over the course of World War II, removing buttons. For example, there's a little tab here to basically be your belt. So they're cutting away material to speed up that production. So we see it with their weapons, we see it with their uniform, trying to make it modular. And over the course of the war, soldiers aren't going to be issued brand new uniforms. They might be issued a later version of a jacket, for example, but they might have the old version of the pants. And it's all about trying to streamline the process so they can get the equipment in the hands of the soldiers and start winning some of these battles, which they're effectively going to do. And they certainly do a lot better in the economy side of things, as well as in the military side of things in the later portion of the war. We're not going to really talk about too much into every single battle, but as far as the economics and getting the gear that soldiers need, the British are certainly far more effective than the Germans. The British mechanized their supply line. They certainly had tanks. They had troop carriers to help out the soldier, mobile artillery units, and so they were very, very good with that communication and getting the tools needed to win the war. And of course, they certainly did. And then, of course, the Cold War will start, and that's a conversation for another day. I hope you enjoyed this very quick overview of World War II and some of the British experiences of World War II and being engaged in a lot of different fields and being able to adapt to those situations to accomplish their mission. Thank you.